We realized that it was just a visual work by each of the so basically, go back and forth. I made some phone calls. Call me up. Pretty nice. So if you know what your mathematical values are, yeah, we're calling those. Yeah, it's the way it works. I would write the first whatever. Often you based on having this. You listen and learn structure for 10 times for every chapter. So that you have
that's very much famous Tufte diagram.
Oh yes, the one on the left.
Really
Napoleon.
First draft, because that
He made it. Oh, the sun. Yeah.
Design architecture.
All right, because there you see like dependencies. Can you see English?
Arrow is shown proportionally. So in this one, sizes and stuff are intended visually. We can certainly do this, because what we do with those diagrams is we estimate effects, and once we've estimated them, we can incorporate them in the final presentation in a way that visualizes our findings.
There's no one else.
So hi everyone.
That's a great idea.
Cool. Yeah.
Hi, Ricky. Welcome to this talk by our journalist in residence, and I'm extremely happy, that you were here this summer. And then Dana Mackenzie actually has been trained in mathematics. He has a PhD in mathematics from Princeton, but he's been doing science writing for the last 20 years. And he's published books, 2 previous books, right? The Big Splat, On the Origin of the Moon, and The Universe of Zeros.
Universe in 0 words.
The universe in, what is it called?
Yeah, okay. Sorry about that writing. Universe in 0 words.
In 0 words. So it's a history of equations. And apparently it's about 24 great equations. And I was trying to think to myself if I know those 24 great equations. I didn't get to 24. So I'm very curious of reading that book as well. And today he's going to talk to us about a book that he's written in collaboration with Julia Perrell on the history of cause and effect in science. And I just want to say a word about the program of Journalists in Residence. It's a new program since 2016 that we have in the Simons Institute, which is designated to bring a journalist to write science writings every semester. And this time it's in the summer, to sort of hang out here and to sort of learn about what we do in theoretical computer science, and hopefully to be inspired to write something about theoretical computer science. And thank you very much for joining us as a resident program and for this topic.
Well, thanks, Shafi, and also thanks to all of you for coming out. I've seen a lot of you around here all summer, and so it's a pleasure to be able to end the summer this way. So as you can see, the talk is about the one thing that you know and machines don't. And so let me not leave you in suspense for too long. Okay, so the one thing that you know and machines don't is cause and effect. So this is something that humans develop, at least in our infancy. Okay, so we play around with things all the time. We play around with what happens if you drop a plate. We play around with what would happen if I were a princess or if I were a cowboy. All of these things seem like harmless games to adults, but they're really children learning the rules of cause and effect and how do my actions affect the world. So by contrast, machines and by this I mean artificial intelligences or machine learning algorithms or what you want, deep learning, if you're into that. By and large, these do not yet have any understanding of cause and effect programmed into them. We don't really give them a chance to understand causation. And one of the central arguments in our book is that if we ever want to design artificial intelligence as what's called strong artificial intelligence, then we need to endow them with the ability to understand cause and effect, both because we live in a world where one thing causes another, and also because they're going to need to communicate with humans, and this is our native language. This is the way we understand the world around us. So, right. Now, our book is not just about AI, although we found sort of one of the things that's very sexy in the news media right now, and you can get a lot of attention if you tell people you've written a book about AI. But really, Udaya has been working, my co-author, Udaya Pearl, has been working on this project for 30 years of reintroducing the language of causation into science. And one of the things he realized very early on, although he was motivated by artificial intelligence, he realized that in fact a blindness to causality was pervasive in science. And the reason for this is that science takes its cues for analyzing data from the subject of statistics. And statisticians are in fact very proud of using what are called model-free ways of analyzing data. And there are good reasons for this. They want to avoid bias. They want to avoid imposing the researchers' prejudices on the data. And so you start out by assuming as little as possible about the mechanisms that produce the data. But Udaya and I argue that this is nevertheless, in some cases, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because in fact, in reality, the scientist has a lifetime worth of knowledge, cause and effect knowledge, that they could bring to bear on the problem, and also a career's worth of knowledge, perhaps developed in collaboration with other people in the subject. And scientists understand very well what causes what. And if you read any article about biology, you'll see networks where genomic networks or whatever, where one thing causes another thing or suppresses another thing. So they understand these things, and yet statistics, orthodox statistics, does not let them bring that knowledge into the analysis of the data. So one of Udaya's goals then is to make this possible for scientists to do. So I just wanted to show you a picture of my co-author, Udaya Pearl, who I think actually probably needs little introduction for a lot of you in the audience. He's a computer science legend. He's won the Turing Award, which is sort of like a Nobel Prize for computer science. And this is a little testimonial in his honor that Eric Horvitz wrote when he was given the Turing Award. So it talks about that he's been the heart and soul of a revolution in artificial intelligence. Now, you might wonder, what revolution is this? And actually, that's an interesting question, because Udaya has been at the forefront of not one, but two revolutions in science, which is probably two more than most of us get a chance to do, but at least one more. So the one that Horvitz was probably writing about was his invention of Bayesian networks in the 1980s. So this is an approach to artificial intelligence that allows the machine to bring in a principled way, probability or uncertainty into its analysis. So before Udaya, people had tried to do this, but not actually using probability theory, and it was kind of, their efforts were kind of kludgy. And his idea of Bayesian networks really took the AI world by storm. So if you'd like to see an example of Bayesian networks, there's probably one in your pocket. It's called a cell phone. Every cell phone since the third generation has had a coding and decoding algorithm, which uses essentially Udaya's belief propagation algorithm. And I'll try to keep this very brief, but the way it works, when you speak into the phone, your voice is converted into a string of ones and zeros, a digital signal, Okay, those are called the information bits. Those are then coded using what's called an error-correcting code that's intended to improve the fidelity of the transmission. And then that code is sent out by a radio signal to the person that you're calling. And then their cell phone has to decode it and figure out what is the most likely spoken message to have generated that code word that it received. And the problem is that the code word it received may not be the same as what was transmitted. There are errors in transmission because radio signals get static in them. And what that does is it'll flip a 0 to a 1, or it'll flip a 1 to a 0, or it may actually drop a bit entirely. So the innovation in the cell phones is that you actually set up a network of nodes and links between them, and these nodes communicate with each other, sending each other information about the bit that they're responsible for, whether they think it's a 0 or 1. And the probability enters in because they're not sure, but they may have a certain degree of certainty about whether it's a 0 and 1. And by sending millions of messages to each other a second, they eventually arrive at the most likely guess for what the information bits were. So you might notice, well, one thing I should say is that one of the reasons Udea's belief propagation algorithm was so successful is that it's fast. And so when you're talking to your cell phone, you don't realize that it's doing all these millions of messages every second. So now, when he was working on Bayesian networks, Udea realized something interesting, which is that when we look at this diagram, we have a very natural interpretation of the arrows as causes and effects. So you speak into the phone, it causes a code word to be generated, that causes a code word to be received. But there's nothing in the formal theory of Bayesian networks that requires a causal interpretation of the arrows. You can in fact reverse some of the arrows and you can still do the belief propagation algorithm. So the arrows are really just a bookkeeping device, and yet we have this very intuitive sense that that's just wrong to switch one of the arrows. So he started thinking about whether we can take this seriously and what does it mean to have an arrow be in the causal direction versus not in the causal direction. And so at first he thought that you could express it in terms of probability, but he eventually realized that you couldn't do that, that they're actually separate epistemological categories. Causation is distinct from probability, and so you need a separate language for causation. And that language is provided by causal diagrams. So when you interpret the arrows as causes, this becomes not a Bayesian network, but a causal diagram. A couple things to point out about causal diagrams are, first, that effects can have many different causes. So that's a little bit of more flexibility than, for example, you had in the 1800s when researchers were trying to find out the cause of a disease. And usually a disease has one cause. It's a germ that causes that disease. But in 20th century medicine, we have lots of multifactorial diseases with lots of causes. And so this is a much more appropriate framework to talk about that kind of situation in. Also, we don't assume causes are deterministic. And this is, again, sort of a bugaboo of science. One of the reasons for resistance by statisticians to causality was they assumed that cause meant a deterministic cause. And again, I think this comes out of 19th century science, where in physics, for example, if you drop an apple, it will hit the floor. There's no question about what's going to happen. Physics is a very deterministic science with very small errors. At least it was then. Of course, now in 20th century, we know that that's not entirely the case. So again, Udea's framework adapts very nicely to situations where you have uncertainty. And so it's perfect for 20th and 21st century science. Okay, so let me give you a few examples of causal diagrams from the book and what they're good for. The first example is one of my favorites because it involves my dog, Daisy, who's in the pictures. And believe it or not, those are 4 distinct pictures of the same dog. So anyway, so this passage comes from a chapter on mediation, which is, let's see, make sure I have the right spot. Yeah. So mediation is a fancy scientific word for mechanism. One of the things that science is often interested in is how does a cause produce an effect. So you know cause X produces effect Y, but you want to know what's the mechanism. For example, if you flick a switch and the light bulb comes on, what's the mechanism? Well, flipping the switch closes a circuit. So electricity flows through the circuit, and then that causes the filament in the light bulb to start glowing. By knowing this mechanism, you can then do troubleshooting. So if the light bulb doesn't come on, you know either the switch didn't close the circuit, or you know that the light bulb burned out. So in ordinary life, we use this kind of reasoning a lot. Nevertheless, it's been very difficult for statisticians to say what is actually meant by an indirect effect. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is in a couple minutes. So one of my roles in writing this book was to come up with examples that would be easy for the public to understand. And so this is my example to illustrate the idea of indirect effects and how do you elucidate them. So one other thing I should say is that the book is written in the first person, so when I say I, it actually means Judea, and when I say my co-author, that actually means me. So, a little bit confusing, I know. Okay, so my co-author and his wife adopted a dog named Daisy, a rambunctious poodle and chihuahua mix with a mind of her own. Daisy was not as easy to house train as their previous dog, and after several weeks, she was still having occasional accidents inside the house. But then something very odd happened. Dana and his wife brought home 3 foster kittens from the animal shelter, and the accident stopped. The foster kittens remained with them for 3 weeks, and Daisy did not break her training a single time during that period. Was it just coincidence, or had the kittens somehow inspired Daisy to civilized behavior? Dana's wife suggested that the kittens might have given Daisy a sense of belonging to a pack, and she would not have wanted to mess up the area where the pack lived. This theory was reinforced when a few days after the kittens went back to the shelter, Daisy started urinating in the house again as if she had never heard of good manners. But then it occurred to Dana that something else had changed when the kittens arrived and departed. While the kittens had been there, Daisy had to be either separated from them or carefully supervised. So she spent long periods in her crate or being closely watched by a human, even leashed to a human. Both interventions, crating and leashing, also happen to be recognized methods for house training. When the kittens left, the Mackenzies stopped the intensive supervision and the uncouth behavior returned. Dana hypothesized that the effect of the kittens was not direct, as in the pack theory, but indirect, mediated by crating and supervision. Figure 9.6, which I will show you to you, on the right here, shows a causal graph. Okay, so here you can see the direct effect on the bottom line. Okay, so the kittens leading directly to greater success in house training, and the indirect effect goes up the top. Okay, so the kittens cause us to supervise her more, and then that makes her behave better. At this point, Dana and his wife tried an experiment. They treated Daisy as they would have with kittens around, keeping her in a crate and supervising her carefully outside the crate. If the accident stopped, they could reasonably conclude that the mediator was responsible. If they didn't stop, then the direct effect, the pack psychology, would become more plausible. So I'm going to pause here and just say that I think that this is all very intuitive and easy to understand. My wife understood perfectly well what the logic of this experiment is. So you just simply, as I said, you set the supervision level to the level it would have had if we had had kittens around. Nevertheless, this is extremely hard for a statistician to do because statistics deals with data, and data are things you observe in the real world. Whereas when we talk about what would have happened if there were kittens, we're talking about a non-existent world, a fictional world where we had kittens. Okay, right now we don't. So this sort of sentence or this sort of construction is called a counterfactual, and it's one of the prime centerpieces of Judea's approach to causation, and in fact to causation in general. So for statisticians, it's hard to talk about counterfactuals. You can't collect data on them. Nevertheless, we do, in fact, formalize what I just told you in a formula on the next page, which I won't attempt to read. But basically, the whole story here about setting the mediator equal to the value it would have had if we'd had the treatment there, that story is essentially codified in the formula. Okay. So you might wonder what happened with our experiment. So to finish Daisy's story, the experiment was inconclusive. It's questionable whether Dana and his wife monitored Daisy as carefully as they would have if they had been keeping her away from kittens. So it's not clear that M was truly set to M1. Okay, so that's referring to the formula. With patience and time, it took several months. Daisy eventually learned to do her business outside. Even so, Daisy's story holds some useful lessons. Simply by being attuned to the possibility of a mediator, Dana was able to conjecture another causal mechanism. That mechanism had an important practical consequence. He and his wife did not have to keep the house filled with the foster kitten pack for the rest of Daisy's life. So anyway, so there's this sort of a fun example of how a causal diagram changed my life, at least made my life a little bit simpler. So let's look at a somewhat more serious example. So this is illustrating another issue that comes up in causal analysis called confounding. So it comes from a paper from the New England Journal of Medicine published in 1998. They were studying elderly men and asking whether these men had positive beneficial health outcomes from regular walking. So in particular, they looked at a group of people who walked at least 2 miles a day. We can call those the intense walkers, and other people who walked for less than a mile a day, and we can call those the casual walkers. And so the question is, will walking increase your lifespan? Well, one thing I want to say right away is that the data alone cannot tell you the answer to that question. So the data that they collected was very impressive. So they observed the mortality rate of the intense walkers to be about half the mortality rate of the casual walkers. So this looks really impressive and like, wow, I want to go out and start walking. But we can't leap to a causal conclusion from the data. Why can't we do that? Because there might be confounding factors. So, for example, it could be that the people who walk more do it because they can walk more. They're younger, maybe they're healthier. And so if that's the case, then perhaps their age is the explanation. So for example, suppose we observed that the intense walkers were 10 years younger on average than the casual walkers. And suppose we observed that they also lived 10 years longer from the beginning of our study. Well, in that case, the effect would be entirely due to the age, and none of the effect would be due to the walking. So this is an example of what statisticians call a confounder. And it's really easy to recognize in a causal diagram because you see a forking arrow pattern, the arrow going from age to walking and the arrow from age going to mortality. So when you see that fork, you know that you're dealing with a confounder. So statisticians have known about confounders for decades, and they have ways to deal with them. They're fairly simple to understand. For example, if we knew that age was a confounder, we could simply look at 60-year-olds. And that way we'd be comparing like to like. And if we saw a difference, then we could infer that walking was the reason for it. Trouble with only looking at 60-year-olds is then you're throwing out most of your data. So there's more sophisticated ways to do it. You can stratify your data by age. So you can look at the 60-year-olds and the 61-year-olds and the 62-year-olds and look at the walking and mortality in each group. And you can reweight the data so that the age structure of the treatment group is the same as the control group, or the walkers and the casual walkers. And that's another way of controlling for age. Okay, so in fact, the people who wrote the study did control for age, and they controlled for a variety of health indicators. They controlled for smoking, and they controlled for alcohol use, and so forth. They controlled for basically everything they could think of. And still, the walkers had a much lower mortality rate than the non-walkers. So you might say, okay, our question's answered now. So let's see what the researchers themselves said. They wrote, of course, the effects of intentional efforts to increase the distance walked per day cannot be addressed in our study. So in other words, they punted on the main question, which was, does walking increase lifespan? They said, we can't tell you. So we can tell you that walking is associated with a longer lifespan, or sorry, with reduced mortality, but they're not going to say anything about causation. So what Judea and I argue is that this is the attitude that needs to change. The only thing I disagree with or don't like about this paper is those two words, of course, because those two words show me that the researchers have been brainwashed by their statistical training to think that in an observational study, like the one they conducted, in other words, one where you don't randomize who walks and who doesn't walk, you're not allowed to make any causal conclusions. And this is simply not true. It may have been true once, but it's not true anymore. And so we can address the causal questions, and we should, because the people reading this study, or the people who are going to take some actions based on the study, are you and me. We want to know, if I walk, am I going to live longer? So we don't want to know about association. That doesn't mean anything to us. So society demands questions, answers to the causal questions, and if we can provide them, we should. Now, if you're afraid that we left out some confounders, that's okay. What you can do is put in the article, you put your causal diagram in the article, you show what the confounders were, and if someone 10 years from now discovers another confounder that you left out, then you can go back and reanalyze it, try to collect data on that confounder. But if you put forth a good faith effort to identify every reasonable confounder, then why should you not then say what your causal conclusion is? Because that's the whole objective of your study. Okay, now you might wonder, were these researchers more cautious, for some reason than most researchers? And the answer is no. In fact, just last year, the editors of the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is one of the leading medical journals in the country, wrote this on their blog. If it isn't a randomized clinical trial and is a report of an observational study, such as the one I told you about, then all cause and effect language must be replaced. So in other words, if these researchers had tried to say that walking improves your mortality rate, they wouldn't have been allowed to. So again, Judea and I say that this is an attitude that needs to change. And fortunately, we're not the only ones saying it. So in the American Journal of Public Health this spring, in May, there were 7 papers that all took issue to a greater or lesser extent with the recommendation of the Journal of the American Medical Association. For example, Miguel Hernan, who's at the Harvard School of Public Health, wrote, arguably the biggest disservice of traditional statistics to science was to make causal into a dirty word, the C word that researchers have learned to avoid. And so what Judea and I want to do is to bring the C word back into science. Okay, so let me give you one more example of a causal diagram and what we can get from it. This is one we actually discuss a lot in our book. It's the question of whether smoking causes cancer, which is a really interesting historical debate. In the 1950s and early 1960s, this was a very controversial question. And the reason was that the leading statisticians at the time, such as R.A. Fisher, said you can't tell whether smoking causes cancer because there may be a confounding factor, such as a smoking gene that predisposes you to smoking and that perhaps also predisposes you to cancer. Right. Other people didn't talk about a gene, but they talked about your personality or your constitution. So maybe you're just a tough-living son of a gun who smokes and drinks and cusses and gets cancer. So it all sounds a little bit preposterous nowadays, but there was real discussion of this. So the situation here is we have a confounder of smoking and cancer. And unlike our previous example, we don't have any data on the confounder. Because in the 1950s, it wasn't the genomics area. We couldn't identify individual genes. We could barely even see DNA. So there was no way to collect data on the confounder. And so our method of adjusting that I talked to you about earlier won't work. okay, because we have no data to adjust with. So what Uday has discovered using causal diagrams is that if you can collect data on an intermediate variable, such as tar deposits in the smoker's lungs, and if you can assume that that's not affected by the confounder, then you can in fact separate the effect of smoking from the effect of whatever this putative confounder is. So for example, the argument might be that if the tar accumulation is just a physical process that has nothing to do with your genes. So if you have this set up, then you can in fact get the causal effect. Why is this important? Well, because you can't do a randomized trial. You can't tell one group of people don't smoke and another group of people please smoke for 30 years, 2 packs a day for the sake of science. Okay, that wouldn't get you very many volunteers, even in the 1950s, I don't think. So, but by using by using the causal analysis, you can emulate what the result of the randomized trial would be. And as I said here, the auxiliary variable basically lets you pick out what effect, how much of the effect is coming from smoking. And although this particular example can be debated, and we discuss that in the book, the general framework is available for any situation. If you have 2 variables, x and y, a treatment and an effect, and a confounder that you cannot collect any data on, you can still control for that confounder if you can observe an intermediate variable that's shielded from the confounder. This principle is not taught in any statistics books, and yet I think it should be. Okay? It should be a sort of standard next thing to try if you can't do a randomized controlled trial. So it's called the front door adjustment formula, and hopefully some people will start using it.
So is that different from
Yeah.
instrument? Is that not an
It's different. Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So she was asking about instrumental variables, and that's another simple diagram which basically, if you think of putting a variable here and having an arrow leading to smoking and then going straight to cancer, then that's another circumstance where you can get the causal effect. And only reason I didn't put that up here is that was discovered before Udaya, so it was known for quite a while. But again, the causal diagram allows you to see why that works. Yeah, and so I think the unfortunate thing is lots of people know about instrumental variables, but very few people know about the front door formula. And so I don't see any reason why this should be so rare and instrumental variables should be so common. In fact, statisticians have shown great ingenuity at discovering instrumental variables. And I think if they applied themselves, they could also find these shielded variables that we talked about here. Yeah, so that's a great question.
Are
Yeah.
we allowed to interrupt or should
Yeah, absolutely. We love interruptions.
So I'm just a bit confused, like, if you have a smoking gene and it causes smoking, then that will affect cars. So when you say shielded,
Right. Right, no direct effect. Yeah, that's right. So, and we're using here our intuitive understanding of causes and effect that we form from the early years of our lives. So if we understand that tar deposits are formed by the literal physical accumulation of tar in the lungs, that has nothing to do with what genes you have. Okay, or at least you can make that argument. Now,
I mean, for me, intuitively, I would think if you smoke, if you have the smoking gene, then you have tar and not otherwise. And so,
okay.
like,
So
it sounds like you're saying you need some other arrow additionally to tar.
sometimes people wonder, should we be able to draw an arrow that sort of starts here and merges with that? Udaya doesn't draw arrows like that. If you have a case like that, that's called moderation. So that the smoking would moderate that variable. So if in a case like that, Udaya would draw just an arrow from smoking to tar. So the way he phrases it, which I kind of like, is that you draw an arrow from A to B if B listens to A. Okay. So does tar listen to your smoking genes? Do the tar deposits, are they affected directly by the gene? And we're arguing that the answer is no. Okay, that because genes work through a whole different method. They transcribe proteins and stuff like that, and that has nothing to do with the formation of tar. Now, you can dispute that, and there was a statistician, David Friedman, who gave a very cogent critique of Uday's arguments and said, in fact, that you can't assume that. But the general principle still is valid, that if you can say that there's no that this does not listen directly to that the only way it hears about the gene is by hearing about the smoking, then you can use this front door criterion and you can get the causal effect. Okay, thanks. All right. Yes, Umesh.
Just say that we should go back to using the scientific method where we posit a model, and if the data is consistent with that, then we say, okay, the model is true and the model involves causation, so we believe in causation.
Okay.
And now what you're doing, what would make perhaps Judea's method is saying, well, you don't need the entire model, you can pare it down so that you have only small pieces of it that you assume, and then that's enough to infer causation.
Well, yeah, so Umesh's question was about modeling and how much of the model do you need to draw. I think that a lot of this discussion may actually, for physical scientists may seem a little bit odd, because in physical sciences you do have a model of reality which is expressed often with equations, sometimes not expressed explicitly. So for example, we sort of think of turning on the switch as causing the current, even though the equations are pretty are agnostic about that. But in statistics, in physics, you do have models, and physicists talk about the standard model of particle physics. So they understand that models are essential for understanding reality. But in statistics, that's not the understanding. So statisticians see it as a virtue to have a model-free method for analyzing data. So what we're trying to say is, please bring models back in. For people in social sciences or in medicine, that's already a step forward. It's not something that they do every day. Yeah, I think your hand was up next. So, yeah.
So I think one of the problems with that is that you can have lots of different models that all generate exactly the same data distribution. So you can't necessarily rule out models. You might have two models.
Right.
Completely consistent.
Exactly. Yeah.
Observational way to distinguish.
Yes.
That's the reason why you have to have a model before you go to the
Right. Yeah.
But isn't that precisely why one talks about the Occam principle? So in fact, we always have, there are always more models than there's data, and so you can always fit as much as you want. But then as long as you then also impose an Occam principle, and you say, well, are you overfitting? Are you not?
But if we go back to the previous slide, I think the problem is that you could have exactly the same observational data on smoking and cancer.
Yeah.
So two very simple models, one where you have the smoking gene and one where you don't, they generate exactly the same data. They're both very simple. How do you distinguish one from the other?
Yeah. So sometimes, right, I should say, sometimes you can falsify the model based on the data, but not always. And there are many cases where you can have two different models for the same data. Actually, we give a nice example of this in our article in the Wall Street Journal this spring. And so there it has to be your common sense, your understanding of the situation. And not necessarily yours, because that may, not just yours, because that may make it sound arbitrary and subjective. But if it's reflecting the consensus of the scientists in the field, then we argue it's worth doing. And if the consensus changes, then you have healthy scientific debate. But at least if you draw the model, then you have something to debate over. And that's not common practice, and it's harder to debate over the assumptions when you can't see them explicitly. Yeah, great questions. Okay, let me, yes, you had a question too. Yes.
A relationship between the p-value and the ability to declare causality. In other words, the confounders would probably introduce more variability into an experiment. And that you might need a higher causality to say that this is a relationship. You have a 0.05.
Yeah, yeah.
Or to declare causality, you might want to get down to 0.02 or 0.05. 0.01.
That's a really good. So his question was about the relationship between p-values and causality. So I think, as I understand it, you're saying maybe to get causality you need a lower p-value, 0.001 instead of 0.05. I don't really agree with that. So as I said before, causation and probabilities, which is really what the p-value is referring to, are different categories. And there was this, going back to the smoking and cancer chapter, there was a very interesting attempt in the 1960s to codify rules for inferring causation that were not quantitative and were not, did not have a methodology like we had here. But one of the suggestions was strength of effect. And so, for example, in the case of smoking and cancer, the effect was so strong. The smokers had a 9-fold greater risk of lung cancer than the non-smokers. And heavy smokers had a 25-fold greater risk. These are huge risk ratios. And so the argument was, because they're so huge, this must be a causal effect. But you can easily come up with examples with risk ratios like that where it's not a causal effect. So the two really I think of as independent questions. And in many cases, we would be able to use the same statistical techniques, but we just have a different interpretation. And so where you say walking is associated with lower mortality, I would say walking causes lower mortality subject to this causal hypothesis. And we're interpreting the same different data just in a different way. And I would argue I'm doing it in a more useful way. So, yeah. Okay, so to conclude with the examples of the causal diagrams, what causal diagrams can do for us, they can tell us what experiments to conduct. That was the example with Daisy. And they tell us how to interpret our data. So in the walking example, they told us age was a confounder, so we needed to adjust for age. They cure the fear of confounding because we put down our confounders on paper. We say what we're assuming, and so we leave it open to the community to judge. Have we controlled for all the reasonable confounders or not? And if we have, then we have every right and we have the responsibility to talk about causality. And finally, they give us new ways to extract causation from association. And that's the example of that is Udea's front door formula, and there are many more examples. So, and this in particular would look like black magic to statisticians of the 1950s, but it's absolutely possible today. So, bringing this back to the conclusion, or to the beginning, in the beginning, the title of my lecture was, what do we know that AIs don't? So let's come back to AIs. What does this have to do with artificial intelligence? Well, I want to show you a picture of what happens when you have a machine learning algorithm that does not understand causality. So this is the Uber automobile that ran over a pedestrian in Arizona in March of this year, the first fatality in a self-driving vehicle. And the National Transportation Safety Board, in their preliminary report on the accident in May, said that the cause was a software failure. What was a software failure? Well, so as you can see, the car is equipped with a LiDAR mechanism that's on the top that's supposed to detect things in the environment that the car needs to pay attention to and perhaps avoid. So 6 seconds before the collision, the LiDAR detected the pedestrian, but it didn't know it was a pedestrian. Then a second and a half before the collision, it realized it was a pedestrian and determined that an emergency braking maneuver needed to be applied. Did that happen? No, it didn't. So there was no emergency braking maneuver. Why not? Because Uber turned it off. So anytime the self-driving mechanism was engaged, they turned off the emergency braking assist. Why on earth would they do that? Well, we don't know for sure because I don't work for Uber and Uber isn't really saying. But I talked with one expert on autonomous vehicles and I read an interview of another one, and both of them said that they believed the problem was spoofing. So spoofing is when the vehicle thinks something is a threat that really isn't. So for example, it sees a sign and it says, whoops, I better brake. or it sees an overpass, oops, that's going to fall on me, and I better brake. So, well, actually, it doesn't think it's going to, it just brakes. Okay, so it was braking in situations where it shouldn't. Now, obviously, okay, it would have been much better for Uber to try to understand the source of the problem, to try to correct it, but instead what they did was they just turned off the emergency braking and hoped that that would solve the problem. And this is what the result was. So I don't know, we don't know for sure what, if any, causal models they had in their software, probably none. But what we can say for sure is that if you want to put an autonomous vehicle on the road in a very uncontrolled situation, then it needs to be able to understand something about causality. It needs to understand that signs are not going to walk into the road, that overpasses aren't going to fall into the road, but a pedestrian might walk into the road and you'd better be careful. And a great example of this occurred to me the day after I gave this talk the first time. I was driving along the road, I saw a pedestrian, and I saw him look over his shoulder. And to me, that was like a bell ringing. This guy wants to cross the road. He's looking back over to see if any traffic is coming. So I didn't need to think about it. I understood. I understood the causal sequence there. And so a self-driving vehicle needs to be able to do the same things. It needs to be able to identify pedestrians, identify when they're a threat, and especially if he's looking if he's going to cross the road. You need to be able to tell that sort of thing. So you need causal models. Okay, so this is just a picture from our Wall Street Journal article. I kind of liked it. So a robot can't tell whether the rooster crow causes the sun to rise or whether the sunrise causes the rooster to crow. So you can't tell from the data. The data will show you they're associated. Very often when the rooster crows, the sun rises right after that. But you don't know the data can't tell you the cause or the effect, or whether there even is any cause or effect. Okay, so this property puts machine learning programs of today mostly at what we call the bottom rung of what we call the ladder of causation. So the bottom rung is association, where you see patterns in data. You see that the rooster crow is associated with sunrise, but you don't know what causes what. This is also the level that most animals are at. So Pavlov's dogs associated the ringing of a bell to food. The next level up is intervention. What happens if I change the world, if I change my environment? Okay, so I make a tool to do something. So this is already a higher level because it involves doing rather than seeing. And that's a big difference in our book. For example, if the animal could actually think of, once it observes that ringing the bell seems to be associated with dinner, if it actually thinks of making a bell and ringing it, that would be already a big step towards understanding causation. And the top level I mentioned to very briefly earlier is called counterfactuals. And that's where you're asking, what would have happened if I had done this? So I did this, I saw that such and such happened, and now I want to know what would have happened if I did something differently. So this is a uniquely human thought pattern, and I think it's a big part of what makes us human. It's part of morality. So when you're learning morality or you're learning correct behavior, you make mistakes and you ask yourself, what should I have done? What would have been better? Okay, so that's counterfactual thinking. And we also discussed this in connection with the Daisy example earlier. So when we were writing the chapter on counterfactuals, I was struggling a little bit with examples and how to communicate this to the general public in a easy way to understand. And then it hit me that there's a famous poem by Robert Frost about exactly this thing. Okay, if my thing will work. Oops. So the poem, The Road Not Taken, I believe is what it's called. So he comes to fork in the road, and he says, "Sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler, long I stood." So literature and poetry are full of situations like this that are interesting, where you want to know what would have happened in these counterfactual worlds. And what's interesting is not that we wonder, not that we ask the question, but the fact that we can actually answer the question so often and agree on the answers. So Robert Frost at the end of the poem thinks he does know what would have happened. He says that by taking the path I took, that has made all the difference. So that means that he could evaluate this counterfactual. And so what we want to do is to enable machines and statisticians to do the same sort of thing. So that's pretty much the end of my talk. There's one more slide here just for fun. After the book came out, I was like literally glued to Amazon.com because I wanted to see the ranking, how the book ranked. And it actually went into the top 100, which was very exciting. And so I took a screenshot to commemorate the occasion. And so there we are, number 93 on the Amazon Top 100. And what I thought was really funny was number 94, which is called Baby Touch and Feel Animals. So this gives you an idea of the competition if you want to write a bestseller. So I thought we're doing pretty well. You know, if you can write a serious hard science book and have it actually outsell a book with cute baby bunnies on the cover, then you must be doing something right. So I'll stop there, and if there are any questions, I'll be glad to take them. And also, if anybody wants to buy books, I'll be glad to sell them to you or autograph them if you already have one. So anyway, questions, Umesh?
So, just going back to the whole model question versus these diagrams. It seems, two or three observations. One is when one, if one's following the scientific method, on the one hand, there's a bigger burden because you actually try to model reality in some way, so you have a much more detailed model. Mm-hmm. You're trying to predict everything about it. Whereas when you're looking at one of these diagrams, so for instance, in the case of tar and a confounding factor, essentially you're trying to, it's a much simpler diagram. You're not trying to explain all, the entire reality, so it's a much easier thing. But on the other hand, you're actually making a claim which is harder, which says there does not exist any confounding factor which directly affects the tar.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's on the one hand a much simpler task, on the other hand it's a much bigger task. And so, just saying a little bit more about that. So, you talked about, publication in health journals and the fact that causation was a dirty word. It sounds to me like, another way of presenting this result would be, for lung cancer would be to say, the result of that study should be that either lung cancer causes,
either
smoking causes lung cancer, or there exists a confounding factor.
Yeah. That's a very good way of putting it. Yeah.
And then the second thing that the authors could say is, given our experience, we believe there's no such confounding factor.
Yeah, that's great. You make so many good points there. One thing I do want to disagree with, which is these diagrams are a model. Okay, so you've been sort of contrasting these to a model. They're a model. They're just a simple qualitative model. Now you can actually dress them up with all sorts of detail, and in fact, UDEA completely endorses that. So behind these arrows, you can have equations. So if you have an arrow from A and an arrow from B, both leading to X, that could mean X is a function of A and B. And so you could get a model in the classical physical sense of model where X equals F of AB. Sure, yeah.
When I was saying model, I meant really a mechanism. So
okay, yeah. Yes. Right. Yeah, okay, all right. Okay, so then you said several other things that were really great. So if I can remember them all. So one thing is, right, the causal diagrams are a very qualitative model, and certainly more qualitative than people in the physical sciences are used to working with. But the wonderful thing about them, the amazing thing about UDEA's work is how much just this qualitative model can tell you. So for example, if you have a confounder, it tells you that you need to adjust for it. And they're very simple and actually fun rules for telling exactly what variables you need to control for and which ones you don't. So that's one of the really cool things in Udea's work. And then you also mentioned something that is not always easy to realize on first blush, which is that the absence of an arrow is in many cases more meaningful than the presence of an arrow. Because the absence of an arrow actually means the independence of the two variables given the values of their parents. So there's actually a statistical testable assumption there. So in that case, the front door diagram, certainly the absence of an arrow from the smoking gene to tar is a big assumption and a very powerful one, which enables you to get your causal conclusion. Yeah.
How do you select which nodes that you would put on the front door diagram? For example, when I think about lung cancer and causation, if I think back to the television commercials of Marlboro in the 70s, I would actually say that's a bigger node than perhaps the smoking gene. And that's a good question. So what things do we put in? Well, I don't know if I should go back all the way. What things do we put into our diagram and what do we not? So ideally, you would put in everything, but that's a little bit impractical. And so there you have to use your judgment as to what is really having, say, a statistically significant effect. And so if you think TV ads are, and if you think that that's somehow different, from among the smokers and non-smokers or something, then absolutely you can put that in. So the diagram is only a way for conveying our assumptions and as well as our existing knowledge. Anything else?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.